All right, everyone. We'll start in for our final half hour of today. We're approximately halfway down the syllabus. We've talked about the introduction to historical study. We've talked about the Jesus of the gospel tradition. I've talked about the birth, of what we know, what we don't know, what we wished we knew about Jesus. Talking about how this whole framework, I would have loved to have had, 150 volumes of historical biography of Jesus. So, there's a whole period of Jesus' life that would just be marvelous to know about. I've often hoped that, when they're digging around in the sands in the Holy Lands, that maybe sometime they'll find a volume or something that might open some doors. But we know very little from Jesus, after he appears at his in the temple, and then we really lose him during all those adolescent years until he appears with John the Baptist. So that whole area of his life, which must not have been significant, because again, gospel writers chose not to give us any information about that, and that could be for two reasons. One, they didn't know about it. Or second, they just didn't think it was significant, So Jesus, played soccer. it doesn't really make any difference, I guess you didn't play soccer in those days, but maybe.
But Pastor, if one of the Gospels didn't think that his birth was significant.
Yes. Yeah, it could be.
It's like...
Again, Mark may not have known the birth story. That's always the question we'll never know. Did he leave it out because he didn't know about it, or did he leave it out because he didn't think that was the most important thing?
Right.
So we won't know that, but it would certainly be nice to know that. There are a few Gospels. There are a lot of Gospels, by the way. When they chose we'll talk about this later on. When they chose the four portraits and the four snapshots and the four impressions, or however you want to think about that, they had a lot of things to choose from. They had the letter of Clement, they had the Shepherd of Hermas, they had probably the Gospel of Thomas, numerous writings, and they chose those. And the reason they chose those, as your text will tell you, is because they were the criteria that was early established is that it had to be someone that had contact with Jesus himself. First-person witness, or at least close to a first-person witness. So that's the reason that those Gospels tend to be the choice versus all these other Gospels. In the 2nd century, you'll get the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Infancy, the Gospel of Jesus, the Gospel of Mary. There's a wonderful book back there called The Lost Gospels. That has a whole detail about all these other Gospels that, and here we mean Gospel simply means a writing that was written. But the Church Fathers felt that these were the authentic, these were the most accurate, and these were the ones that for all time will be the ones preserved. So that's what we have. Interestingly enough, if you just want to know historically, we don't have any of the originals. We have only copies of the originals. So that also gives you a little pause, because in copying things, there can be transmission mistakes or things. But we know that the Spirit works through the Gospels and through the teachings to bring us the authentic witness. And while the details may vary between one account, it's the Sermon on the Mount, and in another Gospel it's the Sermon on the Plain. We think that's exactly the same story. One located at one place, one located at the other place. Is the location important? Of course not. It's what Jesus taught. And so, again, you read with a mind, because God gave you a mind. You do detective work to try to read between the lines, and you read the story both literally, and then you begin to read it interpretively. And so you find it. So, this is where we now come to the end of the 1st century. Now remember, the writings of Paul are in the 1st century, the Gospels are in the 1st century. John becomes the last Gospel, sort of filling a theological overlay on the Gospels. In other words, John gives us interpretation, not so much facts. We don't have historical detail in John. What we have is interpretations. John is looking now at maybe 60 years back to 30, and he's writing in the 90s. He's getting to be an old man now. Many of the early apostles are dying off. It's very important that this stuff be written down, otherwise it'll be lost for history. So John's looking back and he's filling in, trying to interpret the meaning of many of the themes in the Gospels and in the Jesus tradition. Now we turn the century into the 2nd century, and we find that while the Gospels and the apostles and the early church leaders were beginning to sort of shape Christianity, we have two major strains of Christianity that develop out of this first wonderings about who this Jesus really is. And one of the strains that you who attended the Date Academy in the spring now know is that James became a very important and prominent figure in early Christianity. So much so that James was considered to be, by historical detail, the brother of Jesus, the actual brother of Jesus. Now, this brings us into a kind of a theological quandary, because in tradition, Mary remains, in the early teachings of the church, particularly in Roman Catholicism, Mary remains ever virgin. So now the question is, how does Jesus have brothers and sisters? Now, the gospel writers and the writers of the New Testament, it's right there. It says Jesus' brothers and sisters. They came, his mother and the brothers were with him, and so forth. Now the question is, how do you get around that? If you're not concerned that Mary is ever virgin, and that teaching comes later, then Jesus could have earthly siblings after Jesus was born. It does tell us that Jesus is the firstborn, right? Right. Okay. So that's okay with the virgin story or the early story. So we haven't fiddled with that at all. And so after the virgin birth, it could be very likely that it was a natural thing between Joseph and Mary that they would have had other children. And so when James is referred to as the brother of Jesus, it could be very highly likely that he is the earthly brother of Jesus. And that doesn't jeopardize any of our later teachings at all, except if you get into the ever virgin position, and then you have to accommodate that. So how do you accommodate that? Well, some scholars have said if we believe that Mary remained a virgin forever, and that there were other siblings in the family, this is the way some have answered it. That Jesus was married before. And that he had, his wife died or whatever, and so he had some children. I mean, yeah, but that's
Jesus.
Yeah, okay. Yes.
It's a good thing we got the oral tradition going on here.
So, yes.
That's the good thing about the oral tradition. Everyone jumps in and
There you go. There you go. These people are sharp. There's nobody's slow in this crowd. All right, yeah. Dropping back. Joseph had children by a previous marriage. Now that's possible. I mean, there's no historical data there, but if we're reading it and we're trying to figure this out, then somebody would say, well, how about this? I mean, he was married before, he had some children. Oh, okay, well, that's possible. And then you could call them siblings of Jesus, because they were, weren't they? Yeah. Okay, now others have taken it and said, no, that sort of diminishes Joseph, and then we get into divorce, and so on. So no, these were cousins. So you'll find that in some church traditions, they say that these brothers and sisters, quote unquote, were cousins of Jesus, but for some reason lived in Jesus' family, and he called them my brother, my sister. You know how we do, a lot of evangelical Christians call everybody in the congregation Brother James, Brother this, Brother that, Sister so-and-so, right? So it's possible that when we're talking about these siblings, that they were either the natural siblings or maybe one of these other combinations. Now, that doesn't diminish, however, the fact that the New Testament talks about Jesus' brothers and sisters. However, we read back into that, okay? Now, what we do know about that is that the brothers and sisters at one point, which is interesting, in one of the Gospels it talks about the brothers and sisters and the family of Jesus thought he was nuts. Do you remember that statement? Now, that's never read on Sunday mornings in the normal lectionary series. The church fathers carefully have edited that out, but they wondered what in the world Jesus was doing, this very risky behavior of eating with outcasts and sinners, this business of going out, into the wilderness and so on. Why doesn't he get a good job? Like we would say, right? My son, he's a flower child, but why doesn't he get a good job and, go with dad, be a good lawyer and, raise a good family and so, it's a good Jewish family, so, they wanted the best. So that's possible. But then they came to appreciate Jesus' teaching and ministry and became known as, and they were the followers of Jesus, right on down, perhaps even to the Holy City. They went with Jesus. The Bible tells us that Jesus was a frequenter in the synagogue. He was a worshiper. He never gave up the religious going to church. Put that, in your mind. Good reason to go to church. Jesus went to church, so should you. But he went to synagogue. So, the other thing is, we know that upon Jesus' death, there is a vacancy. It's called a succession crisis. Okay? And you'll find that in families and in corporations and so on, you need to have a line of succession. In other words, who's gonna step up to the helm? In the royal family in England, we know that Charles is next in line to Queen Elizabeth, right? And if Charles isn't there, then it's the next son. William and Katie. Okay, so there's a succession there. So now the question is, who should be the successor of Jesus? Now, it seems obvious that the prime apostle in the New Testament tradition is Peter. Peter always seems to be the loudmouth, the aggressive one, the one who's telling Jesus what he ought to do or suggests what he ought to do. But Peter is also one who never gets it. Right. Think about that. Jesus is always sort of upbraiding you. Well, come on, you've been with me 3 years and you still don't get it. Get with the program. So, it's very interesting that when Jesus dies in this horrific death of crucifixion, that there's a succession crisis. Do we simply go back to our nets and our business as usual? And it seems as though they did, at least for a while. Remember? They went back to fishing and so on. Well, this is over. It was it was a good time while it lasted, big deal. But we got to put food on the table. So let's go back. And furthermore, I love the smell of fish. So these fishermen, they get back to work. But that's not what the Holy Spirit had in mind. And so now we have a succession. Now here's what's really interesting. Normally, everyone would say that Peter was the successor of Jesus. And certainly in Roman Catholic tradition, he becomes the pontiff, the course. And that's true as years go on. But initially, he is overlooked. And the people that chose the successor of Jesus chose James. Isn't that interesting? Not one of the original disciples or the apostles. Remember, James is not the James that is listed among the 12. That's not the same James. Whenever you read it in the Bible, you'll read James, the brother of Jesus, quote, comma, the brother of Jesus, to distinguish James from the other James, James, son of Zebedee, remember? James and John and so on. So here they have gone outside of the royal family, the apostles. And they, by their own choosing, the apostles, because they're the ones that are deciding, choose James. Now this is often overlooked. People don't realize it. Forgotten, never heard of it, didn't understand it. The reason is they haven't read very carefully to understand the succession. And so why is this? Because, and this is my take on it, other scholars have other takes on it, it would be obvious to choose the person who knew the most about what Jesus thought and taught, right? Who better than his own brother? Yeah. Now think of that, right? These other guys had only been with him 3 years. They're Johnny-come-latelys. John, James, the brother of Jesus, had been with him from the beginning. A brother and sister of Jesus, the family of Joseph and Mary. Joseph, the father, Mary, the mother, however you put that, whether it's previous children or cousins or however. Nonetheless, James is the chosen one. And how do we know that he's the chosen one? Because he takes over the church, where? In Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem is the holy city. That's like Rome today, where the Vatican is. You know, you don't go to Calcutta, Ohio, or East Liverpool, Ohio, to see the Pope, as wonderful as those places are. But you go to the holy city, right? The place where the power resides, where the authority lives. And the place of the highest authority in the New Testament world, and certainly among the Jewish people, and by the way, Jesus is a Jew, remember that. Never forget that. He was not a Christian, he was a Jew. Because the whole idea of Christianity came after Jesus, right? So he didn't know the New Testament, he never read St. Paul, he never read the Gospels, he only knew the Holy Scriptures, the Torah, and the teachings of the Judaic world, and that's why it's so important that we understand that. Now, to put the authority of the followers of Jesus in Jerusalem, because that is the chief city, that's where God resides, in the Temple of Jerusalem. You see, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in Jewish thinking, is where God had a physical presence, where he had a presence in the Holy of Holies. Remember as they went through the Exodus, the Ark of the Covenant, there's a holy presence there. In the Temple of Jerusalem, only the highest priest could enter the Holy of Holies, behind the curtains, where the sacredness of God resided. It was so intense in there that you couldn't see anything. There was so much incense and smoke because the presence of God can't be looked upon. And the priest would enter the Holy of Holies only once a year, and only to tend the incense and to make appropriate prayers. And they tied a rope on his leg so that if he fainted in the presence of God, they could pull him back out. Now, some of my older boys want to put a rope around my foot now, too. But they like to tie my shoelaces. I say, hey, you got it wrong. It's got to be the Holy of Holies, and it's got to be a big rope.
Well, they don't try to give you a hot foot. I mean,
Now, if that presence of God were existing in Jerusalem, and that was so much precious, and where did Jesus go to make his annual celebration of the Passover? Good Jews returned to give thanks and oblations to God. They didn't go to East Liverpool. They went to Jerusalem, right? Therefore, put this in your pipe. If they chose the successor of Jesus to be the bishop, so to speak, the head of the church in Jerusalem, wouldn't that be the most important position of all? Not Ephesus, not Laodicea, not Nicaea, none of those other places but Jerusalem. And who did they choose? James. Now here's where the interesting thing comes in. St. Paul has a little bit of a problem with James. Maybe it's an authority issue. You know, Paul himself was a kind of, if you read his thing, he says, now I'm not going to boast, but I am really the greatest, and I'm the best. Now don't get me wrong. I mean, Paul's amazing. You're in my face, but so Paul is writing these letters to churches that he founded. And he begins to veer off from traditional Judaism. For example, if you believe as that they are then and are and will be forever the chosen of God, which is what the God of the Old Testament has indicated. They are the people of the book, of the Torah, and that to be a good Jew is to be in the favor of God. And the Messiah will come not to the Romans or to the Egyptians or to the Americans or the Germans or the Swedish, and well, they might come to the Slovaks. But if you believe that, and Jesus believed that that was the case, his mission was to the Jews. And although he breached Jewish law by taking care of Samaritans and others, nonetheless, his main ministry was with them. You know, always the debates were with the Pharisees and the scribes and this sort of in crowd, right? And so James maintains a Jewishness of early Christianity. The synagogue is still in place. You still worship in the synagogue. You still read the Holy Scriptures. You still practice the dietary rules. You follow the Passover traditions. All of it is still in place, just as it was in Jesus' time, and just as Jesus practiced it, James maintains it. That's the Jerusalem church. The Jerusalem church might be thought of as a sect, S-E-C-T, or a offshoot or a division of Judaism. Put it another way, we might be called Jewish Christians. That is, we believe in Judaism, we believe in the teaching, we believe in the monolithic God, monotheistic God, we believe in the authority of Scripture, we believe in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we believe in the entire tradition as Jesus did, and we operate within the additional teachings of Jesus that amplify the Old Testament writings, but we operate within the family. Hence the first major controversy of the church. Because St. Paul says, well, you know, the Gentiles, that means everybody else. I mean, you know, we're essentially Gentiles. We're the outsiders. We're not, you know, we haven't been born in the line. Jesus really had a concern for the whole world. And therefore, all the Gentiles, which the Jews didn't particularly care about, because remember, their thinking was, we're the in crowd, we're the chosen, we're the family, and all the others, you know, there's all these pejorative, kind of antagonistic opinions toward the Gentiles, you know, those people over there, those outsiders over there that eat, you know, don't observe the Sabbath. And they don't wash their hands before they eat, and they run loose and free. But to be a good Jew, you know, we really believe that the dietary laws are in place. We don't eat pork, and we don't do all these other things that those people do, the Gentiles. Now Paul, you know, who has this miraculous conversion, who was originally a persecutor of the Christians, has this miraculous encounter with Christ on the road, and he's thrown off his horse, struck blind, and so on. And all of a sudden, he becomes a great advocate of Jesus. But he sort of goes his own way and says, no, it's the Gentiles that are, you know, no one should be left out. This exclusive club no longer applies. And so the first controversy comes between James and the original followers, Church at Jerusalem, and St. Paul. Because to be a good Jew is to be Jewish through and through. That means that every male child must be circumcised. circumcision is the sign of the covenant. Okay, that is what God determined would be the sign of the chosen, the circumcision of the male. One of the first controversies with the Gentiles was, hey, I don't want anything to do with that. Particularly if you're older, you know. No, I think I'm going to be heathen. No, I'm happy. No, Paul. I'm happy the way I am. So Paul says, forget this circumcision business. That's not important. God, I mean, that's then. This is now. You know, we got to be modern. You've heard that in your churches. You know. Throw out that old stuff. You know, no, that got to have me. I can see Paul doing that. You know, in all his humbleness. And so he immediately comes in. The first conflict is over this issue, because for James and the original followers to become part of the chosen community, you have to follow the rules, the regulation, the laws prescribed within Judaism, part of which is circumcision. Now you can come in, but you have to be properly brought in. Paul says, forget that. We'll just take anybody that comes down. Hey, you want to be a church member? Yeah, just pump a few, put a $5 in. And what happens? James and the others think, hey, I don't know about this guy. You know, first of all, he killed us. He was a persecutor of us. Now, you know, he's running there, founding churches and so on, and he doesn't have the message. He's teaching something that's contrary to our faith. And so they call Paul in, or he makes at least a journey down, and a couple in Acts, and you'll see that in the writings. And it's very interesting. It says Paul makes a trip to Jerusalem to check out with James and the elders whether what he's teaching is correct or not. Now that's fabulous, because it's a little bit of a window into a controversy. There must have been a problem there. Now Peter and James, Peter happens to be on the scene too with James, and they are sort of, you know, keeping the church running the way they believe Jesus taught and so on. And here's this outsider with these, in German we call it Schwärmerei, that's the sort of, you know, these loosey-goosey people on the outside. And so they finally, first of all he brings the offering down to Jerusalem. And then they have this other little conference, and they make a decision. And the decision is really interesting. The decision is that James will remain as the church in Jerusalem, the established church, and they will give Paul the sort of blessing, sort of a backhanded blessing. Okay, you can go out and establish the church among the Gentiles. And so we have then the two strains of Christianity. Now, what happens here? How does Paul get so much an ascendancy so that most all of Christian teachings, or major bulk of it, is Pauline? Some scholars have said, we are not Christians, we are Pauline Christians, meaning we follow in the stead of Paul. Paul has taught us everything we know. Romans, what does who wrote Romans? Paul. What does Luther say? That's all from Paul, not from Jesus. Not that Jesus disagrees with it, but the point is, it's all Pauline. And so some people say, we really have now fallen into a Pauline Christianity rather than a Jamesian Christianity. How does this happen? It so happens that the Jerusalem, the holy city in Jerusalem, is sacked, overrun, and destroyed in the year 70, and the temple is destroyed. And once the temple is destroyed, there is no longer a focus or a locus for people to come to the temple. The holy city is gone. James is exiled and later killed. Peter is off to Rome and later killed. And so all of a sudden, the Jerusalem Christianity, a Jerusalem church, begins to disintegrate. The Jews on their side hardened their opinion so that they are less tolerant of these so-called Jewish Christians. And then later, by the means of Roman imperial power, they began to persecute the Christians versus the Jews. The Jews will be tolerated, the Christians will be persecuted. And Paul becomes then the successor of that kind of teaching, which is what we know today. Much of our theology is based on Paul rather than James. And James then is lost to history. And the whole Jewish Christianity becomes sidetracked and lost. They disperse out of Jerusalem and eventually are lost. So the first real great controversy is an internecine controversy. That is an internal controversy between the Pauline Christians and the Jewish Christians. At the same time now, all this is happening is there's a lot of bishops, people in authority. Remember, bishop, episcope, that means an overseer. When you read in your book, often he uses the word overseer rather than bishop, but it's the same. That's what the original meaning was. There are a lot of individual bishops, church leaders, and so on that are beginning to have their own take on what Christianity should be. Remember, there's no papacy, there's no creeds, there won't be an official creed until 325 in Nicaea, the Nicene Creed. So in these first 200 or 300 years, there's sort of statements of faith, but no official statement. So nothing is written concrete yet. And so as a result, we have the development of what we call heresies. Now I want to caution you on this word. Heresy has a bad reputation, because if I call you a heretic, that means you're really a lost soul. You're a complete unbeliever. You're on the outside looking in. There's no redemption possible. But in the 1st and 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, the word heretic hadn't been so demeaned. It meant another choice, an alternative. Okay? So now we have prominent figures, religious figures, beginning to develop theologies or teachings that are variant. Now remember, there's no central authority, no creed, no statements, nothing that we can say, well, that varies from this. All we have is this, and we have this, and we have this, and we have this. So there's Arian Christians, there's Marcion Christians, there's Pauline Christians, there's Jamesian Christians, there's Apollinist Christians. In other words, there are followers of different leaders and different teachers. And nothing has been tacked down yet. And so when you read of these different theories or opinions or approaches, you're reading the opinions of great people that were not devious, were not out to destroy Christianity, but in the most part they were people of enormous and profound faith. That by studying the scriptures, by listening to the teachings of Jesus, firmly believed that they had the right take. And some of these things were quite strange. Now, it came about because, what do you make of Jesus? Now, was he a human being or was he divine? When did his divinity occur? If he was divine, if he were 100% God, then how could he be killed? Does that mean God died on the cross? If he were divine, then he couldn't be fully human, because he wouldn't have a human mind, he'd have a divine mind. If I read in the Old Testament where God says, go out and kill all the children because I'm kind of mad at these people. And some of these church leaders said, that's not the kind of God that I think about or believe in. And when God talks about God as love, that certainly doesn't sound loving to me, to go out and kill everybody or kill your enemy, kill all the Assyrians, destroy everything in sight. And so one of these great church leaders says, something wrong here. There must be really two gods. There's the God of the Old Testament, but there is a superior God, the God of Jesus. Because love, excuse the word, love trumps. Love trumps evil. And this God does not look like the God that I can claim or that Jesus believes in. So there must be two gods. There must be a lesser God and a greater God. And so one of our early church leaders said, that's the way you get around this, is because Jesus became a more superior religion, a greater religion. And all the evil and all the killing and all the destruction and so on is explainable because that's not the real God who really is the God of love that came in Jesus. So that's one thing. Someone else said, Jesus can't be human and divine at the same time, and if he was born of a human being, he must be a human being, fully. And so they said, Jesus was a full human being. And when you read in the alternative Gospels, or the Gnostic Gospels, for example, there's a story in one of the 2nd century Gospel stories about Jesus playing with his playmates. And in that, the playmate does something that ticks him off. And so Jesus goes, boom, you're dead. And the little kid falls down and he's dead. You know, that sure doesn't look like the Jesus that I know that killed somebody. But, lest the story be too awful, he has compassion on the little kid, says, oh, I didn't really mean to kill you. So I'll heal you. Zap, okay, the little kid's good again. He's back, everything's hunky-dory, just a little mistake there, you know. Now, the point of that is how much was Jesus divine, how much was he human? Was he fully human, fully divine, as we make our confession now? So one of the early heresies, which wasn't a heresy at the time, was a point of view, a thinking. A lot of followers believe that that's why, in some ways, Mark does not have a birth story. And what happens? Jesus appears to John the Baptist, right? Now the question is, why would Jesus, God, have to be baptized? That doesn't make any sense. Because baptism is a remission of sins. It's a washing of regeneration. Okay, well, maybe we can think this way. He did it symbolically. Well, I just want to show you I'm just like everybody else. Of course, I'm not like everybody else, but I'll be like everybody else, and you just want me, and I'll be like everybody else. So somebody came up with that theory, and they said, well, you know, he wasn't, you know, he didn't need to have that, but it was a nice thing to do, and, you know, you sort of go along with your in-laws, you know. But then there was a great group of people and bishops and people that thought, no, this is very significant. And the significance is that at Jesus' baptism, Jesus received divinity. That he was a human being, like everybody else, born of Mary, his brothers and sisters, he was raised and so on, but God chose him to be his son. This is my son in whom I'm well pleased. Remember, at the baptism, there's this voice that comes out of the heavens. Oops, pay attention now, guys. This is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased. You remember John the Baptist says, well, I'm not even worthy to untie his sandals. Why is he coming here to be baptized? Very simple, said these teachers. It's simply because at that moment, God bestowed divinity upon Jesus. This is called adoptionism. God adopted Jesus to be his divine son. So you don't need a birth story at this point, because the true divinity came at the moment in which God consecrated his life. And from that moment on, he began the 3-year ministry of this ministry. So he is a human being fully, but now he has had the overlay. You know, it's just like, you know, I love those Dairy Queen cones, you know, that they dip in the thing, you know. And on the outside, you know, there's a crusty surface, but inside's the real stuff, right? And that's what these teachers were saying. That's really who Jesus was. He was fully human, But at that very moment, and so maybe there were indiscretions in his life previously. Maybe he did strike that little child, you know, in a rage. But now that's over with, because now God has imparted full divinity upon Jesus. And that's called adoptionism. Some said that Jesus wasn't really what you think he is. He's a figment of your imagination. He's really a spirit. And therefore he could suffer no pain, no anguish, nothing. It was just sort of an ethereal, sort of a ghost-like thing that you saw, and then he sort of whisked away into the heavens. And no wonder he can sort of appear into the upper room, because he's just a ghost. He's just a spirit and so forth. So you see, I put forth here about 5 or 6 different theories, none of which were considered heretical at the time, because there was nothing to compare them to, you see? Now we could say, oh, that really is way out in left field, because here we know what the real story is. But back in those days, there was this and this and this and this, and they had tremendous followings. In fact, Arius, who had one of the largest followings, it could have been that we would be Arian Christians today rather than Pauline Christians, had he won out the day at Nicaea rather than what we got. So I mean, it was really in flux, and so that's where you have, and you're reading in the book, these different so-called heresies as we wind up here, as we're talking about the search for truth and heresies. And let me just mention a couple here. On your list, I have all these particular terms down, and we'll be calling attention to many of them. I have a number in front of it, like 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that refers to basically the things which I'm talking about in lectures 1. This is lecture 1. Next week, lecture 2. Lecture 3 and lecture 4. So when you see a 3, 1, 2, 3, or 4 is what I'm talking about, or is part of that particular thing. You'll see it right to the left of each term, a number. Do you see that? There's a number right beside. See these numbers? See those numbers running beside there? It isn't that I can't add, you know, that I know, you were thinking, he goes from 1 to 4 to 3. He never learned his arithmetic. No, it's because all the ones are incorporated in today's lecture and in the text of the first 3 chapters you'll read. So let me call your attention to just a couple that I want to refer to just as in conclusion here. If you look and find the word docetism, let me give you a hint, that's under D.
Oh, hey, it's alphabetical.
Yeah, they're alphabetical. I made this really easy for you. Docetism. And this, and you can write right beside, gave you a little room to write in. It means that that theory, or that particular and remember, these were not at the time necessarily bad. They will become very bad, but at the time it wasn't. Docetism is the heresy that claims that Jesus only seemed to possess a physical body. That's why I told you this sort of spiritual, this sort of ghostly thing. That's docetism. Now, if you look at Ebionism, yeah, okay, give you a minute to write. Docetism is this business of sort of phantom. You're sort of a phantom, sort of a ghost like. And there's pretty, you can see where he comes to that by in the New Testament all these miraculous things of entering places, not going through a door, but just appearing and so on. All of a sudden on the road shows up, and that gives you a sort of sense that maybe, that's where. All right, Ebionism, under E. You see Ebionism? Yeah. This is the heresy that claimed that Jesus was a human Messiah but not divine. and that God adopted Jesus at his baptism. Therefore, you don't need any miraculous birth because Jesus could be born just as a normal human being, but God set him apart at baptism. Yeah, yep. Okay, another one I want you to make a record of is Gnosticism. That's under G, GN, Gnosticism. And Gnosticism claims that the creator of the physical world was evil. And that's why there's evil in the world. And only through secret knowledge can people reconnect with the supreme deity. Gnosticism is really rampant in our world today by all these certain, these offshoot sort of mystical religious teachings. We'll get into that later, like Ouija board type stuff. Not Ouija board, but that kind of thing. You're sort of
Way out there.
yeah, it's a sort of secret knowledge. There are some denominations that claim, if you're really on the inner circle, you get secret knowledge. Rosicrucians, for example. Okay, Marcionism. Marcionism, under M. And this is what I was referring to. He is the one that believes that there are two deities, the deity of the Old Testament, the deity of the New, and that they are different in qualities and substance. Let's see. I think that is just about the final thing I'll say today is the ecumenical councils, and that's the last thing on our syllabus, and then we'll wind up for this evening. And the ecumenical councils, well, I'll tell you what, because the hour is late, I'll start with that next time. Why don't I do that? Let me just say now in conclusion where it says Constantinian captivity, just before that, on the syllabus, Constantine captivity. Because, and let me leave you with this thought, because there were so many conflicting ideas, both these conflicts within Christianity of the Jamesian Christians, the Jewish Christians, the Pauline Christians, the Docetic Christians, the Marcions, the Arians, all this, because there's so much of this going on, Constantine, who is the Emperor of Rome, sees a tremendous confusion. There's a kind of interesting story, I'll read it in the book. He's a pagan, but he's fighting for the, at this point there's two rival emperors. There's the Eastern Empire. The empire was split, and so the Eastern Empire and the Roman Empire, and there's a line of succession issue here. And so the Eastern line wishes to take over Rome, and Constantine wishes to be the captor. And there's a very interesting story here. We don't know how much of this is, again, fable or just a tradition. But Constantine, on the night of the crucial battle for Rome, dreams that he sees in the sky, or he looks up into the sky and he sees a cross. And in the dream, he is told by an angel or by whatever to inscribe this sign on his shields. And he sees the word, "En hoc signo vinces." In this sign, you shall conquer. And it's the sign of the cross. Remember, he's a pagan. And so he orders at the beginning of the dawn of the day, he orders all his Roman legions to put the sign of the cross on their shields. And he miraculously defeats the emperor of the East and wins and becomes the ruler of the Caesar of Rome, of the Roman Empire. And because of this, and because his mother also is a Christian actually, he takes a special liking to the Christians, and he then begins to eliminate all these persecutions and so on that Christians have suffered under other Roman leaders. But he also brings the church into the civil government from the first time. I mean, you know, they were the outsiders, now they've become the insiders. And because of all these theories and all these opinions about who Jesus was or whatever is causing so much chaos in the empire, he calls everybody together to a grand council under his authority called the Council of Nicaea. And he forces all the bishops and said, you will not leave here until you have decided what Christianity shall be. And essentially, this is how they hammer out the Nicene Creed under the pressure of Constantine. And from this day forward, and when you leave here to Canfield or Gordon or whatever, all these outliers, East Liverpool, right, you will know that from now on you are a heretic. Right? And the reason is I said so. Let's stand for the, thank you. Let's stand for the benediction. And yes, read the first 3 or 4 chapters. Well, they're very short. A lot of what I covered tonight is in there. Much that isn't, that I didn't cover is in there too. And then we're gonna move ahead. You can read up to the Nicene controversy, and you'll see in there the issues with Arius and so forth, Athanasian and so forth. Alrighty, let's have the singing of the doxology. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. And after the Lord's Prayer, and then I'll pronounce the benediction. So Lord's Prayer first. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures here below. Praise Him above the heavenly host. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. The Mormon Tabernacle Choir. And now go forth into the world in peace. Be strong and of good cheer. Render unto no man evil for evil, but always hold fast to that which is good. And so may the blessings of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit bless, preserve, and keep you in peace this night and forevermore. Journey well, my friends. Journey well. Amen.